Some will call it destiny, some will call it fate, and some will call it the YouTube recommendation search algorithm, but something has brought us here together for the next 20 to 30 minutes, or however long it takes me to explain how to turn yourself into graffiti. And this is the nice kind of graffiti, really, because you can wash it off the wall immediately, it just kind of walks away. So I guess why not make a tutorial on this? I know people are begging for this in the comments section. They're like, you know what, we need a graffiti tutorial where we turn you into graffiti. This was originally a corridor digital effect. They had this video that came out a bunch of years ago called Brush with Death, and that's what this is inspired by. Anyways, here's the original footage that this is going to be based off of, just so you can understand the workflow, the story. How do I mute this M? There you go. The story of how we're going to get to the final effect. So really all you have to do is film yourself standing in a place. You have the camera move around, having some changes in perspective, having some changes in parallax, and then after you decide, oh, I've been waiting here long enough, you just walk away, okay? So we are going to take this footage and process it until it turns you into graffiti. And by the way, this is what the blend file kind of looks like in the end, just so you can kind of get a sense of what we're doing. We're just going to be creating some geometry with a projection and having a camera, let me show that, having a camera move around it, which when you put it in the right angle, will make it look like your graffiti. Okay, let's get started. Start with video editing, Workspace as always. This is going to be one of those tutorials where I'm like, okay, we're doing motion tracking, we're doing all this, and then for the last 10%, we're going to do the actual effect, because again, most of this thing is actually motion tracking. To get the movement of the camera, you're going to need some motion tracking. So add movie, and we're going to import in our original video, and for me, that's going to be called base footage, appropriately named. We don't need the audio track, and when you click play, there's going to be some caching problems, but long story short, we get our footage, okay? Now, you might think, okay, why don't we take this whole footage and convert it into an image sequence, which, by the way, is the thing you always want to do before you start motion tracking, and I could explain why, frame rate independence, whatever, or you could just take my word for it, zip your mouth, and that'll work as well. You might think, okay, we might need this whole footage for an image sequence, but in reality, we are only going to track everything up until the moment I move, because the rest of it is just going to be the normal footage. There's nothing crazy going on. So let's trim this so that it doesn't go all the way to frame 250. In fact, we'll use frame, Control-C while hovering over this. Control-V is a nice way to copy and paste. We are only going to go to frame 143, which is right where it seems like I start walking, okay? So this is what we are going to be dealing with. Output, we're going to turn this into an image sequence. A PNG sequence is fine, or JPEG, or if you're one of those freaks living in your cellar, living in your basement using BMP, you can use that too, you deformed little thing. PNG sequence is fine. No compression, and we don't need an alpha channel because all the pixels are opaque. We don't have any transparency that we need the alpha for. Okay, so let's create a folder, a directory for where we are going to export our sequence, and we are going to call it Living in the Basement, because that's just what is on the mind, kind of like Binding of Isaac for the people here who are old enough to know what that is. Okay, we call this sequence underscore so that when we render, it's going to render as sequence underscore 000 and 001, and it's going to progress for roughly or exactly 143 frames. So let's let Blender render that, and here on the desktop you're going to see that we have this new folder, this new subdirectory or directory where we have our sequence going frame by frame by frame until we get to 143, and again, this is where we're going to be doing our work. The rest of it is just going to be footage that is unaltered, okay? So once you are done with that, we can just abandon this project like a kid that was only paid attention to for like 10 minutes. We're going to get rid of him. Sorry. And the rest of this is where you want to start paying attention. So let's go full screen. What we are going to be doing first of all is motion tracking, then doing the geometry and projection, etc. So for motion tracking, always movie clip editor and import in the original sequence. So you can either click the first frame, or I like to click all of them because I'm paranoid that everything won't import if I don't do that. So let's import that in. And you can see that we have a couple of issues immediately, or maybe you don't see. Maybe you need a new pair of glasses. But either way, there are some issues here. First of all, you're going to see it's playing very slowly. That's for two reasons. First of all, we have a caching problem, right? You see these purple frames, the ones that are cached, they don't exist for the rest of this footage because we need to cache them. So That's one thing we need to solve. And another thing is the frame rate is going to be wrong. So even if we do cache it, the speed is not going to be what it's supposed to be. So originally the footage was 29.97 frames per second, I believe. And we could just round that off to a nice 30 because image sequences are frame rate independent. So we may as well just pick whatever we want, but something close to 29.97 so we get near real-time playback. Also, for this project to be 143 frames without you typing that in, set scene frames will do that for you, and prefetch will load everything into memory, okay? And you might be thinking, okay, we have everything set up, but there is actually one more issue, and that is the color. Everything's super washed out. It's not that my skin's that white. I am a white boy, but not that white, right? So render tab, color management, make sure this is set to standard, okay? And this is gonna make sure that you don't have any weird view transform color management stuff going on here, okay? So basically what we've done here is set up our movie clip editor so we can begin tracking, and assuming that you've never tracked before, maybe this isn't the tutorial for you, but assuming you've only tracked a little, we are just gonna go through a basic explanation of how we track this shot without getting into the nitty-gritty details, okay? So what I'm seeing here is a shot that the camera's going pretty smooth and we're just going from left to right, or right to left, I don't know. And there's a bunch of stuff that we can track. In fact, the whole wall, this brick wall, is basically composed of places we can track along with the floor, which is why I filmed here. We prepared for this intentionally. Okay, so for the trackers, I'm going to enable normalize. This is going to say tracker, even if there's a bit of lighting change, you know, don't worry about it. Okay, so normalize is going to say kind of ignore some various or some fluctuations in lighting changes. Okay, and for the type of tracker, we can go up this list where as we go higher all the way up to perspective, the tracker is going to be more effective. However, it's going to take more time to compute, so maybe don't do that. Whereas location computes very fast, but you know, it's only going to be tracking a pattern area for changes in location. We don't want that. So I'm going to go pretty high up the list actually, which is not something I always do. We are going to go to Affine, which is going to track changes in location, rotation, scale, and shear. In other words, affine transformations, okay? So I'm going to pick an example tracker. It may or may not work. I'm gonna pick this one right here. Again, that is Control-Click, and you can scale, Alt-S for the search window. So again, this is the pattern area that we are gonna be tracking, and the search area is the area, this is the bounding box where we are gonna be looking for this pattern area frame by frame by frame, okay? And you might be thinking, okay, why did I track this particular spot in the brick wall? Well, it's because that all of this kind of looks the same, and in fact, that's actually an issue for Blender for tracking here. It doesn't know if it's here or on the next frame it's here. They're kind of repetitious, identical, but this one has some white stuff going on here, so it does look a bit different, okay? Once you have your tracker set, Control-T to track forwards and L to lock, and we'll see if it makes it. Yep, that made it through all 143 frames, okay? And the story about motion tracking is always get at least 8 trackers that are very reliable, meaning a tracker that lasts throughout the whole shot with minimal error. So this is a good tracker, like it really is. And as for our trackers, we want them distributed in 2 dimensions. So some of them on the right side of the frame, some of them on the left, etc. And also in 3 dimensions. Some of them in the foreground, some of them in the background, okay? So now let's track something on the floor. Again, getting that good distribution in 2D. So now it's towards the left and in 3D. And let's do Control-T, see if we can hold on to that. And even if you think that Blender won't be able to track something, chances are if this thing has a good amount of contrast, low amount of motion blur, etc., Blender will do just fine. And you can see this does seem to be doing a pretty good job. I am seeing some hops, but we could fix that, or we could just proceed and see if it, you know, raises an issue later down the line. Okay, so I'm just gonna keep tracking, now going a bit faster. Again, Control-T. Okay, that one's fluctuating a bit too much for my liking. I'm gonna have it grab onto a feature that's a bit more distinct, something like that. And really, once you get really good at this and you know which trackers you need to put down, you can just put them all down at once and just hit Control-T on all of them. And in fact, let's try to do some of that right now. So let's try to do one over here. Again, I'm picking this part of the brick because it has slightly more detail than some of the other areas in the brick. Let's also try something over here. And again, we're just trying to get at least up to 8 trackers, if not more. More is better unless you get to a bit too much, and then you have this issue with trying to do best fit models and all that. So let's try 3 trackers at the same time, shift clicking so all of them are enabled, and then Control-T, which should track 3 times as slow, because it's handling 3 at the same time. Okay, so it seems like this tracker made it all the way through. Let's just check that it didn't hop between bricks. That did fine, Control L, and the other two we need to do some work on. So for this one, it made it all the way over here. We just need to increase the search area since our bounds are too small, Control T. And now that made it all the way through, lock it, and then finally this tracker. Let's see, what's the issue with this one? This one's just a bit problematic. It yells in the night terrors. Okay, so 111, I don't think this one's gonna make it all the way through. It's probably gonna get clipped out, although it does seem to hover inside the frame. Let's make it a bit smaller, see if it can survive. No. Maybe it has a chance. Not at all. Okay, we'll lock it, we'll keep it. Even though it doesn't make it all the way through the shot, it is still valuable information. Now this, of course, is a good area to track, and we should be done with tracking soon. I know it's boring, it's not fun. You just want to turn yourself into graffiti, you just want to spray paint, I get it. However, this is an important part of the process. In fact, this is most of the process. I need to stop picking trackers that leave the frame. Let's go for one or two more things on the wall and call it a day, something like that. Okay, that's good. How many trackers do we have at the end? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. In other words, we need one more tracker. Let's pick something here. Although, then again, if we pick something there, eventually my body will intersect it. So we do need to be a tiny bit careful. So let's try to pick something a bit further out. And then to track backwards, it's not Control T, but Shift Control T. And that will go backwards. Okay. I think that should be good. We'll find out in just a second. So we have at least 8 trackers going throughout the shot. Ideally, you do have a bit more distribution, maybe some stuff over here or maybe some stuff over there. And just so I actually follow my own advice, let me just add a tracker. It's not going to last throughout the whole thing, but just so it exists. Once we have at least 8, what we consider solid trackers, it is now time to solve. Oh, I didn't save. That's a good point. Make sure to save. That's important. Now that we've done our tracking, we can try to get a camera solution and see if it works. So let's go to the solve menu. Without looking too much into this, without the definition of keyframe and keyframe A and B and all this, just enable this, which is going to find keyframe A and B for us, which are basically a pair of frames where there's a good amount of parallax in between. Don't worry about it. Just enable this and it will do it for us. Solve camera motion. Okay, so we got a solve error of 0.93 pixels, and if you don't know what that means, what is 0.93 pixels? Is that an A+, an F-, etc.? As long as this is under a pixel, you have gotten what is generally a pretty good solve, and you can see that over in the graphs. Control middle mouse to do this. These red and green lines are the X and Y data of our trackers, and the blue line is essentially, in some sense, our camera solve. You want this to be as close to flat or somewhat close to flat as possible, which it seems to be doing. Just to get a slightly lower solve error, we can also tell Blender, hey, right now you are tracking our camera, right? These trackers belong to our camera, and the more we know about our camera, the better solve we can get. And right now it's assuming our lens is at 24 millimeters. That's how zoomed in we are, when in fact that's probably not the case. So let's have it refined for focal length as well. And then we get down to about half a pixel, which is very good. So now we have our track. We have our solve really. How do we put this in 3D space? How do we do our graffiti, etc. Okay, so now things get interesting. 3D viewport, this is where we're viewing all our nonsense, our default cube, which I'm going to get rid of. To get this camera data inside the 3D viewport, just hit setup tracking scene. Long story short, you don't have to do any complicated stuff. There's a button there for you. Oh, why do I always forget to turn off that alarm every fucking time? Okay. This gets everything into here, and you can see this does give us it does bring our camera into 3D, but it doesn't look like the floor is actually attaching, and that's just an issue of orientation. So what you're gonna do is just pick 3 markers, this one, and this one, for example, or any 3 markers that are on the floor. In fact, let me pick 3 that are near the foreground, not the one in the background, and just hit floor, which is gonna reorient our camera. So this is before, our camera's hovering above, and this is after. It's gonna reorient our camera so it still has the same type of motion, but it's reoriented so these 3 markers, which we can see with motion tracking menu. So you can actually enable your motion tracking empties as long as you select your camera. And it's kind of hard to see with this stuff here. Whoops. You can see that now these markers are on the floor, right? So these are the markers corresponding to the trackers that we have in 2D, okay? So now this is oriented to the floor. However, if I had in a plane, there's still a couple issues. It's kind of off to the side. So just pick one of these that's on the floor, set this as the origin. So it's over here, one slightly to the right, and say from here, from the origin to this one, we can say that is going to be the x-axis. So it reorients that nicely. And then finally, we could do a bit of scaling. So between these two markers, have, let's say, 1 unit in between, or if you want it to be smaller, 2 units in between, 2 units in between, etc. So I'm going to set that to 1.5, and that should be fine. Okay, so we are now done with that. Let's stay in the 3D viewport for the rest of this shot, okay? So what I'm going to do is a bit more manual orientation by just selecting the camera, and then you can just move along the y-axis, x-axis, etc. Let's do it like this. We want our plane right here to be going along the floor. So I'm just going to rotate along the z-axis until that is parallel, at least somewhat parallel, to this line between wall and floor, although we are going to do some shape key stuff to adjust it later. So don't worry too much about it. And just shift this down, do a bit more rotation. You can see it's not perfectly parallel. And there you go. Okay, so it doesn't need to be perfect. This is a pretty good job. And now for the rest of this, what you want to do is create some geometry wherever your actor, your CG matter, your whatever is going to be in the shot, okay? So we have a floor, edit mode, extrude on the z-axis to get the ceiling. So now we have this kind of geometry that is tracked onto our shot, okay? So again, make sure that no matter what frame you're on, this geometry is overlapping. In other words, you won't be able to see your actor in solid mode is overlapping your actor, right? If we had something like this, where it's like that, yes, it's going to be overlapping in the end, right? But in the beginning, it's not going to be. So make sure you have full coverage throughout the whole shot, but don't waste space on the areas where you don't need to. So stuff like this. And it doesn't need to be this tall, and maybe could be a bit further out. Okay, so let's see. This is fully covered. That's pretty good. And you could try to refine this again and again and again, but you don't need to get crazy over here, okay? So now that we have our geometry, the question is, how do we project? And what we're going to be projecting is the last frame, the frame right before I turn into real life. So it's as if this is frozen in time, projected and on the wall as the graffiti. How do we project this and have it go backwards in time so it still looks like graffiti and it goes over our footage? Well, to do this, what we are going to do is go to the shading workspace. We're going to create a material for this. So make a material and input a image texture. And can you guess what image texture we're going to be using? That's right. We're going to be using the last frame because that is what we want to project. So just scroll down or just hold that to go faster. And now we have our last frame. And I know what you're thinking. Beautiful. We've done it. How could it look better than this, right? Well, to get this projected on correctly, we're going to need to either mess with the UV coordinates or with any coordinate system. So you could change this to like window coordinates. That would do it. Or something that I like to do a bit better is add in a modifier. And we're going to use a UV project modifier. In other words, take our UV map and alter it based on some kind of projection. And that projection is going to be altering our original UV map with an aspect of 1920 divided by 1080. So just take your whatever resolution, X over Y, which in this case is going to be 1.778. You might have a different aspect ratio, so do watch out for that. And for the projector, you might think, okay, we want to use our camera. Which kind of makes sense, but causes quite a few issues, as you can see. We don't necessarily want to use our camera. In fact, what we want is our camera, but only on the last frame, so it's not doing any of that movement. One simple way to do that is we're going to take this, which right now is moving with this camera solver constraint. We're going to take that and use the bake action command, which is going to just enable all this and click OK. It's going to get rid of that constraint and instead just put all of this in keyframe, so the motion is still the same, but now it's keyframed. I'm going to take this camera, I'm going to duplicate it, and this is going to be our projection camera. And for this one, we just want it to stay still on the last frame, and you can do that by selecting the last frames, Control-I to invert, and then delete. So it's going to be keyframed on the last one. So the camera's moving, and it matches our projection only on the last frame, okay? So for our projection, go back to the plane, modifiers, and project based on our projection camera, and it's almost looking correct. Like you can see the graffiti's there, except, my knees are looking a bit fucked, This is me after I do my 2-mile run that I can barely do. My knees aren't liking it. So it's almost correct, although we do have a good amount of distortion, and good in the sense is bad, but not bad as in the sense of good, right? This is a bad thing, right? To fix this, we actually just need more geometry, which you can either do by subdividing, and you can see the more subdivisions we have, the more corrected this is, or for something slightly more procedural, just add in a subdivision surface, but make sure this is above, by the way, 2.9 with, or is it 2.83? I don't know. 2.9 with the fact that you can drag modifiers. So nice. Set this to simple, and the higher we go, the less distortion we're going to have. So let's stick with 4, okay? So now what do we have? Now we have, let's go to rendered mode so we can actually see it. Now we have a setup where we have our graffiti, and then all the way here, and then right here, it's gonna, basically everything's gonna line up and I can just walk away. Now, of course, we do have a couple issues. First of all, it doesn't look like it really matches, and that's just because of a visual thing. If we go to our camera, the one that's moving, and go to its background images, just make it more visible, and then we're actually gonna be able to see what's going on here. So that's one issue. A second issue is we have this corner thing where it's kind of repeating the texture, and this is because right here, this is slightly out of frame, and it's trying to create texture to project. We want to tell Blender, okay, fine, cool. It's a nice trick that you can do. We don't care, we don't want that. So go to the shading workspace and take repeat, which is going to repeat the texture, which is exactly the issue that's happening here, and set it to clip. In other words, make it black wherever we don't want it to extend past the original bounds of the image. In other words, don't repeat. That's what clip does. But you know, black is good. It's better than texture, but we want it to be transparent. So final thing you need to do, I swear to God, we're almost done. Mix shader, add in a transparent Bsdf. In other words, tell Blender wherever it's black, make it transparent. So add that in. And where do we want it to be transparent? Well, it's going to be based on the alpha channel. In other words, a channel that says where we have texture and where we don't. So just plug that in there. And then because Eevee, and I always say this, because Eevee is garbage, our transparency is not going to work until we enable our blend mode to be something like alpha blend, hash, or clip. So I'm just going to pick alpha blend, okay? Although it does create that issue where now we need to disable this so we can actually see what's going on. I wonder if the other ones do that. It seems like alpha hash doesn't, so maybe that's my new favorite, okay? So now we have this going on where, you know, we don't have any messy projection stuff because a lot of this is actually just clipped out as transparency. And now the final issue, kind of the big one, is while it does line up here on the last frame, everything before that, you can see especially with the pipe, there's quite a bit of drifting going on. And is that because our motion track was bad? Well, no. You know, our solve was 0.5 pixel error. And our geometry should slightly be lined up correctly. I mean, really the issue is our geometry isn't perfect. But instead of just going back to square one and fixing everything, there is a kind of easy fix. It's kind of a cheat that will make everything look better. And that's just kind of modifying our geometry, just kind of literally moving it until it looks right. And we're going to keyframe that process. And in other words, we're going to In other words, we're just going to be using shape keys, okay? So what I want you to do is add in a shape key on the last frame. This is going to be just, you know, the geometry right here. We're not going to mess with it. We're also going to add in another shape key, and this is going to be the one where we mess shit up. So that's going to be our second shape key, and we'll do it on this frame where what I'm going to basically be doing is just taking this vertex and just lining it up so that this pipe lines up and this wall lines up just a bit. And this is why, by the way, we did our subdivision in the modifier, not here, because then we can only move one vertex instead of a bunch of them when we had subdivision, etc. So this is a nice reason to do that. So just kind of line it up the best you can. It doesn't need to be perfect because it's already a weird looking effect. So if there's a bit of artifacting or artifacts because of this, that's not too big of a deal. And there you go. So now we have our basis shape key and our second shape key that can be visualized when we increase the slider. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up to like frame this one, and maybe we'll edit it a bit more so it lines up on this frame. We're going to keyframe this so it's fully using this shape key, and then on the last frame, we are going to go all the way down back to 0 so it's not doing anything weird, okay? And wow, that was weird. And for the interpolation type, I'm not going to use a Bezier curve. I'm going to use a linear so that we have a smooth interpolation, or in fact, a linear one. So once you do your shape keying and you do your correction, again, you could spend more time doing this. Now it's essentially time to render, but if we go to the compositing workspace, you're going to see there's a whole bunch of garbage, a whole bunch of nonsense here, right? All we want really is our foreground render layer, which has, you know, this information here, which by the way, you should go to film, transparent, so it's, you know, a transparent thing, and we could slap stuff under it. Really all we want is that and the footage that we're going to slap under it. So we can get rid of this, we can get rid of all these things. so that really all we have is the foreground render layer going on top of the movie clip with an alpha over node doing our overlaying. Now, one thing that you might have noticed is, why is there all that stuff there in the beginning? Well, it's because we hit setup tracking scene back in the movie clip editor. When we were messing with this, we hit setup tracking scene, and what it does is it creates the compositing node situation that we had before, and also it creates a background render layer, which we don't need. Okay, so just get rid of that. It will save you on render time, okay? So right now, I think we should be ready to just do a render. So let's do F12. So it's gonna render our render layers, which looks exactly like you'd expect, and then we have the footage and we slap it on top, and you can see it's looking pretty good. However, you can kind of see, let me move this, you can kind of see the boundary where we go from render layer to footage, and that's because, yes, it's not perfectly lined up, but also it's because, you know, we're not making it very easy on ourselves. What we want to do is take our alpha channel, which is defining this boundary, and make it slightly feathered, or actually very fucking feathered, so that it's easier on us, right? So that we don't have to do so much work with lining up with shape keys, etc. To do this, you can just add in a dilate and erode node. It's actually all you need. You set it to feather, and you take your feathering and you put a negative number so it actually caves in by, let's say, 100, or actually, yeah, 100 pixels. So this feathers in by 100. If you did positive 100, it expands it. That's a dilation. We want an erosion, okay? And if we use this for our alpha, as what goes in for the mixing factor for alpha over, so we put this in here, now you can see that we have the same thing, but everything's just a bit nicer. So this is before with the harsh edges, and then after, and you can mess with this procedurally to get the type of boundary you want. And really for the rest of this, all you have to do is render out not just this frame, but all of them. You do the Control F12, and it's just going to be going frame by frame by frame. Oh, and by the way, something you might have noticed there, it's a good thing I did that. You're going to notice that some of this is actually appearing over here, and that's because of the feathering. So you might want to pick a smaller number, or actually create a larger piece of geometry that goes further along the wall so that we don't have this issue. But long story short, you're going to add more shape keys so that this lines up. And in my original, you know, I spent a lot of time doing the tracking and shape keys just so it would look correct. Yeah, that's the story. Anyways, what you want to do is basically render this out. And again, you have to hit F12 every time to update this composite network. And what you are going to get is basically, once you do that, you're going to get the first part of this effect right here, the kind of trippy part. And you can see, if you look kind of closely here, you can see some kind of areas in the brick that aren't lining up perfectly for the exact same reason as before. So you're going to get pretty much everything up to frame 143, and then in your favorite, you know, video editor, whatever, you are then going to cut back to the rest of the footage where you don't really have any kind of effect. So there you go. You now know how to make the graffiti effect. It's not that difficult, but there is quite a bit of troubleshooting and motion tracking and all that. So anyways, there you go. Hope you learned something. If you want access to exclusive tutorials that are not posted on either of these channels, Default Cube or CG Matter, or maybe you want behind the scenes or early access, or maybe project files for, you know, Blender projects like this, etc., or maybe you just want to fund tutorials like these, Patreon is the place to do that. I appreciate all, I think nearly 500 of you, it's gotten to be quite a bit, that are part of that. You are directly, all together as a bunch of people, funding these tutorials, but I do thank you for that. It really is the only reason that I could make these every single day. There you go. Now you know how to turn yourself into graffiti. So maybe don't, you know, do a bunch of vandalism. Keep it on the down low. Anyways, that's it. That's the tutorial.